World War III is over. Did you miss it? Coming to you from deep in the hood. This is the Eurasian Century. All right, we got a lot to talk about. Uh, Now, there's a sense, of course, in which it's not over yet. By that, I mean the Ukraine war. That sense is not that it isn't clear who the winner will be. The sense is that the West is far from admitting to itself that defeat is inevitable and imminent. Uh, they're deeply in denial. They're speculating about a freeze or ceasefire, or spouting nonsense about a stalemate, maneuvering and counseling the government in Kiev toward negotiations, conjecturing against the will of Zelensky, conjecturing about the Western reconstruction of Ukraine after the war, still hoping against hope for a victory or at least a non loss against Russia, and in general living in a self imposed fantasy world bubble of its own creation, completely detached from reality. And by it, I mean the West. It's destined to simply walk away from the Ukraine debacle, ceasing to discuss it in its salons and MSM possessions, and it dare not contemplate the consequences of the defeat. That's what I'm here for. Um, Before going any further, we need to discuss something that developed during the Cold War called mutually assured destruction. I don't bring it up because I think there's any real danger of a nuclear war breaking out, um, but I think it's very relevant to the war in Ukraine and the war in Israel and Gaza. In short, the theory is that if two enemies each have a serious nuclear weapons capacity, enough to destroy the lion's share of enemy territory and the means to deliver it, which is important, then in effect they cancel each other out as a matter of practical use. Neither side can use them due to the near certainty that they themselves will be destroyed by the enemy's counterstrike. It's a matter of deterrence. As a result, the decisive military factor becomes the respective conventional capabilities of the parties, not their nuclear arsenals. It essentially works as if the nuclear weapons capacity of each country cancels the other out, as long as they're not fighting on their own territory. If, for example, Russia should decide to invade the United States, or the United States should decide to invade Russia, um, all bets are off. But any place else, um, it does act as a deterrent. It's presumed that the only time when either side would use its nuclear arsenal would be if its state itself was in danger of existential annihilation. This is so because that would be the only time when the state would risk that near certainty that its enemy would also launch. Now, there are other considerations involved in this dynamic. It's called MAD, mutually assured destruction. The main ones revolve around first strike capability and the confidence in the ability to get off counterstrike before the defending country's arsenal is destroyed, including dead man mechanisms. A dead man mechanism is pretty scary, actually. It's a system where you have to do something in the nuclear bunkers periodically, or the thing will launch. It's designed so that if the people are taken out, then the system itself Say the bunker is taken out where the the soldiers are there who would be launching it. Um, but in that bunker, there would be some type of electronic connection with the actual delivery systems that are in a field someplace, um, or in some other different facility, be in a field, but it would be heavily defended, meters and meters of concrete and steel and whatnot. Um, but if the people in the bunker didn't keep sending that signal to the actual launch facility itself, then it would launch. The reason that they do that is, again, if it's to make certain that there would be a counterstrike. If you can guarantee there's a counterstrike, then you still have mutually assured destruction. If a first strike capability uh, means that you can actually take out the other person's nuclear arsenal or their ability to launch their nuclear arsenal, um, then the side that has that first strike capability is for all practical purposes, won already without even having to launch it, which is part of the reason that we're that we have a war in Ukraine, because any launch facilities in Ukraine, anything that close to Russia's border, could take out command and control in Moscow before they would have the ability to contemplate whether to launch a counterstrike or not. That's why 500,000 Eastern Slavs had to die, because idiots in Washington decided that they were going to do the Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse, essentially. Um, so, if a proxy war situation arises, the deterrence only applies to direct exchange, and another set of considerations apply if the nuclear power uses its capacity against the non nuclear proxy of the other nuclear power. So the calculations get complicated. Uh, what all that means is, if Russia were to launch on Ukraine forces, or earlier in the war when it was really just the DPR fighting, if United States or NATO forces had launched on DPR, things would have, at that point, because DPR wasn't part of Russia, would have been more complicated. Um, but the sum total of all that is that there's always a strong bias against a nuclear state using its weapons directly against another nuclear state, because it's likely suicidal. One other aspect to consider before continuing on this: capacity is much more important than professed intention. If I'm a state trying to calculate my defensive posture, I must assume a bad actor on the other side, regardless of how saintly they may be. Governments change, and it doesn't matter that the other side asserts the best of intentions and motives. What matters is what a state can do, its capacity. So assurances that we have no intentions of that NATO is a defensive alliance, and we have no intentions of putting ballistic missiles in a member NATO state, which Ukraine was slated to be. That would not cut any weight at all, um, because they would have the right to do it, and there's no reason they couldn't do it. Now, let me paint a hypothetical for you. Instead of staging a coup in 2014, which is what the U.S. did in Ukraine, suppose the U.S. and NATO had committed about 20% of their military forces to conquering Ukraine. And also suppose that Russia intervened and threw everything that they had against the invading force. And further suppose that the U.S. and NATO forces advanced eventually all the way to the Russian border and then voluntarily stopped. What would that tell you? It should tell you that the US and NATO were demonstrating that they could advance as far eastward as they pleased, and unless Russia was willing to use nuclear weapons, which would be suicidal, they could do nothing about it. Well, that's just what happened, except in reverse. NATO threw everything it could muster into Ukraine, both military and economic, and Russia repelled it all and advanced as far as it wanted, only using about 20% of its capacity. Thus, Russia has demonstrated that it can advance as far westward as it pleases, and unless NATO is willing to use nuclear weapons, which would be suicidal, they could do nothing about it. Now, for those who might disagree that Russia has only used 20% of their capacity in the Ukraine, you may have read obnoxious lies from the West that Russia has poured 97% of its military capacity into Ukraine. Nothing could be further from the truth. Russia's, I calculated it several different ways, and that's where I came up with 20%. If you take the 200,000 that actually are responsible for the territory that Russia controls right now, and you weigh them against 1.15 million, you get something like 17%. If you take the 300,000 that are on the front lines now, and you compare them with what Russia's just announced capacity is or is going to be of 1.32 million, it comes out to, I think, 23%. So, I mean, and I'm not counting about a million. If you, Russia has 2.2 million in its military overall. I'm only counting the 1.3 million that are actually in arms, that would be bearing arms, not administrative, in Russia. So now that's significant that happened. What it means is that the West cannot in any way intimidate Russia anymore. Yet Russia still retains the power to intimidate the West. Sun Tzu, many centuries ago, in The Art of War, elaborated on the idea of winning a war before it is fought as being the ideal way to proceed. What it also means is that it's only a matter of time, a short time, until Europe comes to its senses and reconnects with Russia. Furthermore, when it does, and when Russian energy starts flowing westward again at its previous or greater volume, Russia will have won the war for Europe without firing a shot on NATO territory. And don't imagine the Russians don't know it, and the Chinese, and the Muslims, and Eastern Europe. And if any of them don't understand it, it will gradually sink in as the parties behave as if it's true, because it is. Vladimir Putin delivered proposed security treaties to both NATO and the US shortly before the commencement of the SMO. The substance of these treaties was that NATO would retreat to its 1997 borders, exiting Eastern Europe. That would constitute Russia's new Western sphere of influence. But Russia will also have its economic influence stemming from its renewed supply of energy to Central and Western Europe. I believe, now there are people who will take issue with this because of the Nord Stream incident, but a pipeline is just a pipeline. Where one was built, another can be built, or the first one can be repaired. Governments are rising or are falling in Europe, and eventually Europe will come to its senses, and when it does, it will realize that it's paying twice what it needs to for energy because of the sanctions. Now, the supply from Russia never actually ceased, but it's been substantially reduced by Western sanctions. The economic effect in the West of the sanctions is overturning control of governments and will continue to do so until the West relents. Europe simply cannot afford to persevere with reduced or eliminated Russian energy. It will suffer, and this suffering has and will continue to be transmitted into political reform, peaceful regime change, hopefully peaceful. In the longer term, Russia will be supplying China, India, and Europe, as well as others, with energy. Let that sink in for a while. And in order for it to really sink in, realize that when this is the case, Russia will not need any one, perhaps even any two of these clients to stay viable and strong. However, as Chinese, Indian, and European economies become dependent, or in the case of Europe, redependent on Russian oil and gas, they will find it very difficult, just as Europe has found it very difficult already, to endure the spigot being turned off or even reduced. You can think of this as energy hegemony or even energy colonization, if you wish, but that is the reality. And don't kid yourself. The lesson of the Ukraine war should be that the power of finance is limited because it's diffuse. The power of manufacturing is vital, especially military production, but the power of raw resources, such as energy and food, is king. That is how Russia withstood sanctions, refocused and revitalized its economy, and outfought the entire West due to its superior military production and ability to find markets for its energy exports. China is Russia's, when I say outfought the entire West, what I mean is this. As much of the West as dared to go and fight went in and fought Russia in Ukraine. There were Western elements, Polish elements, German elements, and Americans over there. We did not have the United States military officially in there. I don't think public opinion would have allowed it. And they did not want to see 500,000 American soldiers die the way that 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers died, because all the weapons would be the same, and the training of the Ukraine forces was up to NATO specifications. So you're just talking about personnel. And well, I won't belabor it, but you thank God that we did. That was actually George Soros's idea from the late 1990s, I think, that you just use the population there and arm them to the teeth and use that against Russia. But getting back to this, China is Russia's factory and bank. But Russia has the weapons and the lifeblood of natural resources to protect and supply China. Russia can import from anywhere. Vladimir Putin is a moderate. Some will not believe that, but that's the truth. You look at Medvedev; he's there as bad cop in order to be a valve to let off steam, because there are a lot of voices surrounding Putin who are much more aggressive about these things. Vladimir Putin will not live forever, and you don't know who you will get next. I'm not talking about regime change. I don't think the U.S., I mean, if they had the ability to regime change, they would have done it by now. I'm talking about the natural life cycle of people. Capacity is what is important, not professed intention. Vladimir Putin has, and his general staff, I don't want to just say Putin, they have built up the Russian military to remarkable capacity at this point. And maybe I'll do a program on that at some point. But just, I think it was today or yesterday, they announced another 175,000 mobilized to have a total army of all considered, all personnel being 2.2 million, 2.23 million, or something like that, which is actually larger than the Chinese army. This would be the largest army on Earth. Um, so that's Ukraine. Um, Now they're still fighting, and it's because the West and the Ukrainians don't realize that it's over already. Um, but they'll figure it out here fairly shortly because this buildup is not for nothing. And I think Mark Sloboda thinks that it'll come early next summer. Um, I would be surprised if it came any sooner than the beginning of spring. But I think there'll be the massive onslaught that a lot of people have wanted to see. I think is probably coming because the word is getting out to people around the government and the highest places from people that I trust um, that um, I'm hearing that it's a done deal that they're going to take Odessa, the entire southern coast. They're going to take Kharkov, um, and probably and the military itself. I mean, I think they're going to take at least everything east of the Dnieper, and the military is pretty vocal. The highest echelons of the military are vocal about the fact that it won't be over until Russian tanks are in Kiev. Um, so, I mean, you're still going to have the grinding and the slowness for a while, but you're going to see an increasing meltdown in the West, especially because we're going into an election year, and you know I and the people who are watching this aren't the only people who can do these calculations about what's in store and what has happened. Um, the Pentagon certainly can. State Department, they know what's happening, and that's why they're acting as crazy as they are. Switching focus to Israel and Gaza, um, you may think that I'm being too uh, assertive about these things I'm saying, but I try to explain why I think this. Effectively, the Israelis have already lost this. I say this because it appears that the Israelis show no interest in entering the heart of Gaza in large numbers and entering the underground network of tunnels below the heart of Gaza in large numbers and rooting out Hamas root and branch. They would suffer enormous casualties as a result, and Israel is notoriously casualty averse. This has been the case in all recent conflicts, and in fact, in all conflicts since the establishment of Israel itself. Um, and we've seen this movie before. It didn't have the precipitating um, event, of the Hamas attack on October 7th, but they uh, went into Gaza before and they fought for a while and they retreated because they just couldn't stay in there. Um, and the interesting thing is, there's some of them that are beating the war drums for going against Hezbollah in the north, but Hezbollah has the same um, capacity of underground tunnels that's where Hamas got the idea for doing it that way. So if Hamas survives, it wins. It wins because it lives to fight another day, and it will fight another day. Massive civilian casualties do not faze Hamas in the least. That's the terrible trap in which they have the Israelis and their own Palestinian population. They can slaughter Israelis at will, and the Israelis are reduced to killing civilians. They call it cutting the grass in response because they cannot physically get to Hamas. I disagree with some of the people who watch this probably watch Colonel McGregor's um, talks with Judge Andrew Napolitano, and I understand why uh, Colonel McGregor says the things that he says about thinking that the Israelis aren't actually targeting civilians because he has contacts in the Israeli army who I'm sure he considers friends from his time in service, but they're targeting civilians. They have a word for it, like I said, cutting the grass. They lie essentially saying that they're attacking Hamas with these indiscriminate bombing raids, but it's cold blooded killing of civilians for no other purpose than inflicting collective punishment, collective pain on the Palestinian people to prevent them as a deterrence from doing something like October the 7th again. But the problem is that that's not the effect that it has. It may deter some people, but it also polarizes others, and they're creating more Hamas militants by doing this. What the Israelis don't seem to realize is if they do not actually eradicate Hamas in Gaza and the West Bank, they face perpetual internal violence as a result. If Hamas has the power to kill Israelis to further its cause, it will do so. The only way to deny them the power to do so is to go down into the tunnels and ferret them out. But the Israelis do not have the balls to lose large numbers of their soldiers in the process, and in fact, they have tried similar advances in the past and been forced to retreat. So, as a practical matter, Hamas can attack them at will and with impunity. Now, that kind of capacity is inspiring and contagious to other Palestinians in Israel. I have in mind the West Bank and the rest of Gaza. As it turns out, it was not only Hamas that participated in the October 7th attack, but a number of Palestinian militias in Gaza whom Hamas has trained. I saw a list of them. Was like 7 or 8, 10, something like that. Militias. You wouldn't. Well, I wouldn't have thought that a population of 2 million something would support that many militias, but most of them, Hamas is by far the biggest one, Hamas and Islamic Jihad. So the final war for the eradication of Israel and the establishment of the state of Palestine has begun, but it gets even more harrowing. The other effect of the Hamas attacks was to incite the Israelis to ethnic cleansing and killing large numbers of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. In turn, that resulted in the revulsion of the world, and in particular the Muslim world. Thus, Israel stoking the flames of anti-Israel rage in the hearts of Muslims worldwide, and thereby causing them to put pressure on their respective governments and leaders to intervene on behalf of the Palestinians being mercilessly slaughtered. Thus, you have the Jordanians, for example, holding back Iraqis from crossing their territory to attack Israel. This will only get worse as the slaughter continues, and if it continues long enough, not only will Hezbollah in Lebanon intervene and invade northern Israel, but other Muslim powers might follow. There is already, now last I heard, I think it had already set sail. I'm not sure. I'd have to check it again. But there was a planned flotilla of 1,000 ships from Turkey to Gaza to deliver assistance. And we don't know what's happening to that, but that could be a kind of tripwire for something else. Moreover, just as mad, mutually assured destruction deters the West from using its nuclear arsenal in defending Europe in Ukraine, so a sense of self-preservation prevents Israel from using nuclear weapons in fighting the Palestinians and its neighbors. Iran's conventional arsenal of missiles poses an existential threat to Israel, simply due to their character and abundance. They have hypersonic missiles, and they have lots of them. And it's the kind of thing that Israel can only begin to shoot down with Iron Dome and can't get most of. And it's the capacity to just wipe out most Israeli cities, which effectively is like having several nuclear weapons. The thing deterring Iran from using this arsenal is the fact that Israel has a nuclear capacity, but this works both ways. If Israel were to use its nuclear capacity, it would likely ensure its own destruction at the hands of Iran or Turkey or Pakistan or all three. Pakistan has nuclear weapons and has um, offered to um, deliver a few to Turkey. Turkey has a huge army. Iran is really on the cusp of developing nuclear weapons, may already have them, um, but has already enriched to 60%. And the IAEA found trace amounts of very high, close to 90% enrichment. So, you know, I wouldn't dismiss Iran's possible nuclear capacity as well. So, Israel is unlikely to use its nuclear arsenal unless it is in immediate danger of ceasing to exist as a state. And that's one of the reasons, well, there are a list of reasons why um, Netanyahu um, shut down one of his heritage minister when he talked about using a nuclear weapon against Gaza. Um, they don't want to start talking about that. They don't want that as part of the equation. But that leaves us with the natural corollary of MAD. That is, if use of nukes is suicidal, then the decisive factor is conventional armaments. And the Muslims clearly surpass Israel in this regard. Turkey alone can field 2 million men. And given the depletion of its stocks in arming Ukraine, as well as the limited size of its military, the United States will not be able to make up the difference. This is all the room Israel's enemies need, given their currently advanced technological and general military capacities, to make existence in Palestine so uncomfortable for the Israelis that they abandon ship. Now, whether Israel's enemies will press forward to the end of the state, to end the state of Israel, or settle for merely securing the establishment of a Palestinian state, is a matter of speculation. Israel should hope for the latter scenario, since it appears both are within grasp of its Muslim neighbors. In light of all this, it may be helpful to recall Mackinder's and Speakman's theses again. From last time I talked about the world island and Eurasia and the rimland and inner crescent and all that stuff. I'm just going to blast through this really quick. I'm going to spare you further detailed engagement with these early and mid 20th century theories about world hegemony, except to summarize that the sum total of their work was that in order to contest or achieve world hegemony, the United States and its transatlantic alliance would have to contest and dominate the rimland or inner crescent around Eurasia, this being Eastern Europe and the Middle East or West Asia. I'm going to start using West Asia. For some reason, people are switching over from Middle East or Asia Minor to West Asia. I think it's more accurate in the Middle East depends on where you're located. West Asia just is the west of Asia. So, but anyway, if Eurasian, if a Eurasian power, if the Eurasian power dominates the rimland, Eastern Europe and West Asia, it can control the world island. That's the lesson from both of those geopolitical academics. This seemed like a simple expression of geographic reality at the time, but has been reinforced by subsequent developments, namely the overwhelming importance of energy to industrial economies and its abundant supply in Eurasia and particularly West Asia. Combine that with the fact that Eurasia must have a land route to supply the whole of Europe through Eastern Europe, and in the case of China, West Asia. What I have in mind there is Russia would need a land route through Eastern Europe to supply the rest of Europe. China would need a land route through West Asia in order to supply Europe on the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, China, that's one of the two routes. That's the land route, is through West Asia. There's also a sea route that China is using. We must never lose sight of the fact that the transatlantic alliance, that is the West, has an ideology that insists on propagating. It insists on propagating wherever it holds power and influence, imposing it whenever and wherever it can. This is a paramount consideration in calculating the stakes of the current grand chess game. It is not simply a conflict of secular powers narrowly concerned with nationalistic or imperial dominance from a purely economic and military perspective. This is a conflict of civilizations and worldviews, which tragically is zero sum when it comes to the liberal West versus anyone and everyone else. Neither Russia nor China seek to evangelize the world by force to their respective worldviews, nor does Iran or any other Muslim power actively engage in such an enterprise. Islam prefers at this juncture to defend its homelands, including Palestine, and expand in the West by settlement and demographic warfare, not kinetic. However, liberalism is determined to impose its worldview on all of humanity. It may do so in a Manichaean form by exploiting existing religions, gutting them of their substance, and replacing them with liberal ideology. But replacement and imposition is definitely the intention of liberalism. It does this under the banner of liberal democracy, human rights, which are simply thin masks hiding their ideology and justifying it as worthy of universal legitimacy and necessity. They are militant, totalitarian imperialists, in a word, fascists. And they would destroy Christianity if left to their own devices. Make no mistake about that. Essentially, what is happening in the world now is that Christianity, Confucianism, by that I mean China, and Islam are waging war in order to survive and prosper against fascist liberalism. And liberalism is losing. What do you expect when you try to impose a regime of feminism, multiculturalism, and perversion on the rest of the world? These things are utterly unnatural, more so than Bolshevism, and it was inevitable that the religions of the world would join forces to eradicate this ideological virus called liberalism, if nothing else as an act of self-preservation. They are correct in considering it existential conflict. They realize that they must slay the Grendel of liberalism or it will consume them. It's apparent when you look at what has happened in the United States to the mainline Protestant churches, as well as to a lesser extent perhaps the Church of Rome, that liberalism has slowly eroded their moral and theological traditionalism and replaced the substance of their beliefs underneath a veneer of classical language with progressive ideology. This is apparent in the Protestant ordination of women, acceptance of homosexual lifestyles, and embrace of feminism and abortion. In the Roman Church, the Vatican has taken strides in recent years, toward the acceptance of LGBT lifestyles. There is a move towards Eucharistic ministers as a substitute for female clergy, and a tacit acceptance of abortion and other facets of feminism in the general society. Thus, liberalism has undermined, to a large and decisive extent, Western Christianity. The widest possible net one could cast to gather more or less traditional forms of Christianity in the United States would only take in at very most, perhaps 35% of the population. And I think it's considerably lower than that. This would include most evangelicals or fundamentalists, traditional Catholics, Tradcats, Eastern Orthodox, Mormons, and smaller groups. Some people might not consider Mormons to be Christians for some reason. I'm not prepared to debate that. I'm just throwing them in there. And smaller groups of ultra-conservative Christians such as the Amish and Mennonites. This is not to say that liberalism does not infect a significant number of members in some of these groups, only that they represent the territory where relatively conservative Christianity can be found to exist at all. The rest of the country is liberal and non-Christian, liberal and as well as being having Muslim, Jewish elements, and other groups. Now, some percentage of the liberal group are conservative liberals, which explains the competitiveness of the Republican Party in general and MAGA in particular. But those with an explicitly Christian worldview definitely represent a minority of the American public. This is why Russia terrifies Western liberals. Under the guise of seeming to be stuck viewing the Russians as Soviet communists and replaying the Red Scare, what liberals really object to and wish to exclude from their societies and suppress in humanity in general is traditional Christianity. To them, we are the Christian Taliban. To understand that to some extent, you have to realize they believe that they can subvert other religions and do the same thing to them that they have done to Christianity in the United States. We, the traditional Christians, are the ones who are a testament to the fact that they are not capable of doing that, not only to us, but to the rest of the world's religions. Thus, Russian Orthodoxy is their worst nightmare, much worse than communism. Progressive liberals were accommodating to communism. They are fine with Chinese communism or Chinese state capitalism, for instance. I don't really consider the Chinese to be communist. There's a Communist Party of China. It just happens to be the ruling party, the ruling clique there. They could just as easily change the name on the door to the Confucian Party of China because there's such a large private sector there. But anyway, but it is totalitarian at this point. Still, the Chinese society is. They're moving to some extent towards not only to the nationalist, which isn't not exclusive with totalitarianism, but some type of spiritual something. But they're not there yet. So it's still totalitarian and ostensibly secular, and that's why progressive liberals are fine with it. What they object to in China is not their ideology, but their economic prowess, which is making them a peer competitor of the United States. Politicians of both parties in the U.S. have been hip deep in bed with the Chinese, sometimes literally, for decades. The conceit was that economic development would wean them away from totalitarian political structures. This failed miserably. Nonetheless, there is nothing like the hostility for the Chinese among Western liberals as there is towards Russia. Orthodox Christianity is really the only plausible explanation, though they never stated as such and would vehemently deny it in any overt sense. However, they have made attempts to insinuate that the Russian Church is a danger in a number of statements regarding attempts by the Russian government to use parishes abroad to subvert the West and pain complaints about Patriarch Kirill's support for the Russian war effort. This is also a factor in the establishment of a pseudo-Orthodox church by the West on the territory of the Ukraine, an entity open to liberal policy modifications regarding morality, much like the mainline Protestant confessions. They despise what they do not understand and cannot control. If you search what happens if Ukraine loses the war on the Anglophone internet, what you will find is that no one is seriously contemplating this certain eventuality. At least no one that is allowed to appear in search results. I use Google. At most, you get conjecture about future Russian aggression against this or that other European country, or heightened danger of Chinese aggression regarding Taiwan, that type of thing. But no one seems to be allowing consideration of the practical aftermath of a Russian victory and its necessary consequences to be the topic of widespread conversation on the internet or other state-controlled media. Part of this is that the powers that be simply cannot and will not allow themselves to accept this as a serious possibility. The reason is very simple. When they begin to contemplate what a Russian victory would mean, and they look at it honestly, the inevitable conclusion is that, as a practical matter, Europe is lost. This is not a matter of military conquest, but rather of economic reality. What has been demonstrated is that the United States, the only power that could deter Russia, has no intention of doing so through the use of nuclear weapons due to mutually assured destruction, and no ability to do so through the use of conventional forces. So Europe is lost. There's no need for further military altercation. Ukraine was it. And on some level, though they will not admit it in public, everyone with a clue, even the West, knows it. Now, theoretically, assuming Russia does not press its victory, the West can behave as if nothing has in fact changed and continue in effective denial of reality for some time. That is how it has proceeded so far. And at some time before or upon the failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, it was apparent to any honest geostrategic analyst that the decisive point had come. If NATO throws everything it has short of nukes at the Russian wall and makes no dent, even as Russian military capacity, only a fraction of which has been used, continues to increase by the day, then it's over. What is the practical consequence of this? Well, though they may not admit it in the MSM, people in the West, elites first and then the general public, will begin to behave as if Russia won. If Russia does not press its victory, this will take time, but the realization will sink in fairly quickly. Russia can do as it pleases, it is we who cannot. That's the thing that will sink in. That is a harsh awakening, but inevitable under the circumstances. Russia will dictate terms of the settlement in the Ukraine and will control the European security arrangement. Its armies have shown that they can advance at will, and the West simply cannot prevent them from doing so without implicating MAD. World War III is over. The West is lost. Present perfect tense, it's a done deal. China and Taiwan, Israel and Iran, these are simply icing on the cake, cementing the overall Eastern victory. It is not that America can't keep printing money. It can. But it can't fight or defend with money. And the cold, hard fact is that neither it nor Europe can produce weapons at a rate necessary to make them competitive in their respective spheres of influence against Russia, China, and Iran. And MAD, mutually assured destruction, being what it is, conventional superiority is dispositive. In the emerging aftermath of the Ukraine war, Washington seems to be suing for peace in all directions. It is signaling it wants no part of the war with Iran and is attempting a clumsy rapprochement with China. It is slowly sinking in. Of course, they're still being childishly defiant as far as the Russians are concerned, because the Russians are the one that have administered the beating. And so they're still talking about crazy ideas in Ukraine, which they don't have any control over anymore, really. Of course, America and several European and other states possess nuclear weapons, and so will not be militarily conquered. In fact, neither Russia nor China show any proclivity for expanding beyond their professed spheres of influence. So many people may not even notice that World War III has been decided. What should become increasingly apparent over time, however, is an emerging economic discrepancy between the level of development in the West and the East, and the capacities and limitations to influence international relations of the respective parties. If you find this program valuable, please hit like and subscribe. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.